Vampires have traditionally stood in place as metaphors for many different things as long as the monster has been around. Every culture has their own version, and their early adaptation to the screen shows that no matter what time period, the social fears of that time will play out on the screen between a pair of fanged teeth. In 1922's German film Nosferatu by F.W. Murnau brought the modern vampire legend to the screen in the form of one eerie and not at all attractive Count Graf Orlok. Played by Max Schreck, Orlok follows many tropes and appearances set in place by another vampiric count of modern history. Bram Stoker's horror novel Dracula was far from the first vampire story, however it is the first to be written and produced in such a large quantity that it still makes top horror lists as well as required reading lists for high school lit classes even today. Nosferatu takes many aspects from this 1897 novel, and very few plot points are discarded, as changing the names and locations seem to be enough room between the original source material and the recreation film, as it is considered to be a different beast entirely, despite the novel only being around for about 25 years. The biggest fears that vampires have historically represented come from the inhuman nature of a being who looks and performs as human, but can only be killed or injured by a very short list of items. This fear of the dead coming back, as well as seeking revenge and the uncanny valley effect, pique my interest, as the unchanging look to the monster does little to affect my face blindness. To be sure, these are perfectly human responses set in place millennia ago to protect the tribe and ourselves from dead bodies, as well that may potentially carry diseases or attract predators that may cause a threat to the people that we care for. This fear of disease is featured in Nosferatu, as not only is it set within the last major plague before the 20th century, but it is also filmed and most likely adapted due to the illness of the time surrounding the film in the form of the Spanish influenza. Both versions of these public diseases have made a black mark in the history of humanity's survival. This created an added layer to the undead antagonist in his quest to spread his own personal disease. As Scott Beggs describes Max Schreck's performance of the barbarian bloodsucker, he relates Schreck to carrying himself with the poise of a modern rapist, and stating he is more like a modern zombie than a modern vampire. I agree with his sentiments, as he prefaces these statements by describing the shambling Schreck seems to do in the role, and the only fear of the vampire himself coming from what he could do to the characters and less what he is doing on screen. These takes on the lack of actual horror and the focus on the thrilling aspects of the film are not new. Theodore Huff authored a retrospective on F.W. Murnau's work at the time and wrote a rather scathing review of the 26-year-old German film. Huff relates to the reader that many reviews at the time called the finale a solution of Dostoevsky, a phrase that even Huff himself quotes but does not credit. He claims this makes sense only if the story were wrought with enough conflict and moral ambiguity to deem it a Dostoevskian problem to solve. Of course, as vampire films go today, this one is very cut and dry, but for the time it would have been much more exciting, as they didn't quite have the budget, time, or resources we have today, or even in 1948 for that matter. As much as I might agree with Huff by saying the gimmicky tricks they use in order to give Count Orlok a more supernatural shine may not have aged so well, I do think they were accomplishing things unseen for the medium at the time. I also feel as though this film holds up to the test of time, since it is referenced anywhere in pop culture, from novelty action figures to Nickelodeon's own SpongeBob SquarePants. Not much has survived from 1927's London After Midnight, as historians seem to agree that the majority of the tapes containing the picture burned in a 1965 MGM fire, and thus the recounts of the people who had seen it, as well as the film stills and reviews for the film, are some of the last remaining pieces of media related to this early Lon Chaney romp. Despite it being the first appearance of the international fanged interloper, Americans were not unfamiliar with the concept of vampires and their demonic roots. Nosferatu would get an American release in 1929, but the public had been privy to Dracula and the earlier Carmilla nearly as long as print had been sent overseas. The fear at the time was less disease-focused, as the Spanish influenza had been nearly eradicated in the years following World War I, and this time the vampire in question stood in place of the fear of another international conflict. As Chaney plays a man who is hiding his vampiric nature, so too were audiences building fears of not only another international conflict, but also those who may not have been so sympathetic to the American way. In this flick, Chaney plays a sort of undercover agent, hypnotizing the real killer into reenacting the event from 5 years earlier, only to have the reveal be that the murder was one of passion. The master of the mansion, Roger Balfour, did not approve of the marriage between his murderer, Sir James Hamlin, and Balfour's own daughter, Lucille, and that seemed to cost his life. This time, Chaney acts as a sympathetic vamp and focuses audiences towards a more positive role for the movie monster, only to have his image dematerialized with not only the studio fire, but also the next big flick from the Fanged Freak. As 1931's Dracula, Bela Lugosi follows the novel very closely, coming neck and neck with 1922's Nosferatu in terms of similarity to the source material, even today. As this is before the Hays Code took effect, the folks at Universal were able to do as much as they'd like with the source material and face little repercussion other than the occasional begrudging review describing the gore and inhumanity as not fit for the public. Another fear from pearl-clutching audiences may have been the damage done to the youth by these violent and sexualized films being played weekly. The attractive face of a man who enters a woman's bedroom to exchange bodily fluids in the middle of the night, recoils at the sight of a crucifix, and tears the city throughout that night is enough to make the weekly sermon, as well as just enough counterculture to cause teens to stir, but not be taken from the big screens. Vampires themselves are controversial no matter what time they come from, as creatures of the night, monsters who sneak into your home and drain the life force of anyone they choose, or even just men who house and hypnotize other men. They all can be used as a form of scapegoat depending on the culture at the time. Dracula was written close to 130 years ago, but it is still one of the most adapted horror stories in media due to the timelessness of the literature. As the times change and vampires we watch adapt with them, there will always be an underlying theme of rejection and cultural significance due to the depictions of these blood-sucking nightwalkers.